Hi students, this lecture will be about understanding the edTPA assignment, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. It's advisable that you stop this presentation and print the instructions and template that are found in the assignment folder on the course shell. This will walk you through it. So this is the instructions and template sheet, and as you can see, it's due on June 30th and it's worth 15% of your grade. This assignment is meant to mimic portions of the edTPA that you'll do when you're in student teaching. It's not nearly as involved or as intense, but it's meant to give you a little bit of a taste about the types of assessment analysis you're going to have to do for your lesson. Most of you realize that the edTPA is one of the final certification tests that you must take and pass to be certified as a public teacher in New York State. It involves taping, planning and taping, implementing and taping a lecture, and then writing commentary. For this lesson, you don't have to do the planning, but you do have to look at student scores, and you have to do some analysis and think about how you would reteach. Because what we try to do is we try to use data-driven instruction. We teach, then we look at the data, we assess students and we look at the data, and then we say, okay, well, we either have to reteach, or sometimes we say the students have mastered that it's time to go on to a greater challenge. We're also going to be looking a little bit at how to provide specific feedback in this assignment. This assignment is a science lesson. It's at a K-2 level, and it doesn't really matter if you're not planning to teach science or if you're not planning to teach at that level. The process is the same. And so the point of this is not to learn about science, it's to learn about the process of the edTPA. There are 5 steps involved in this project. First, you're going to learn about some simple science skills. Then you're going to look at a lesson and pick out a science standard that goes with that lesson. You're going to review and score students' work samples for 4 different students that are located in the folder, and you're going to use a rubric to do that. Based on those scores, you're going to analyze both the whole class, all 4 students together, their strengths and weaknesses, and then an individual student who has mastered the standard and an individual student who is struggling with the standard. Finally, you're going to provide a couple of pieces of specific feedback, one for the student who has mastered and one for the student who is struggling. All of the instructions are given in this template that's located in the edTPA formative assessment folder, which is in the assignment folder on the course page. So let's look at these steps. First, learn about the science skills. There's a file, Science Skills, located in the folder, and we're going to take a look at those in a minute. The sheet looks like this. There are 6 basic science process skills. Observing. This is an important thing for students to learn how to do in kindergarten, to see what has happened. Measuring. Using standard measures. So can a student measure with a ruler the length of his desk, for example? Inferring is sort of intuiting what's going on and coming up with causes. Classifying things into groups. Predicting about what will happen based on their understanding or awareness based upon a pattern. And communicating. The 3 skills that we're going to focus on in this lesson are observing, predicting, and communicating. The next step will be to look at the science worksheet to understand this problem. Once you look at the science worksheet and understand what's being asked, you can go to the Science Standards folder in this assignment folder, and look at the Next Generation Science Standards or the New York Science Standards, either one is acceptable, and find a standard at the K-2 level that would match up with this lesson. You're going to write it out on the template. By the way, everything that's in italics on the template is where you need to put something in. So, for example, here you see that you're to enter the aligned standard that you've selected, and that will be worth 2 of the 15 points. Now, what am I going to be looking for? A couple of things. I'm going to make sure that your standard makes sense, that it's at the right grade level. It's not a middle school standard, for example. And also that you've written the entire standard out and not just given me the number. So NY, you could say NGSS, K point, whatever, and then write the entire standard out. Let's take a look at the lesson. This is a lesson coming from a K-2 level called Will It Bend? In this investigation, we are going to test many materials for bendability, flexibility. I want you to sort the materials into 2 groups, those that bend and those that do not bend. You need to examine, predict, and test at least 8 materials. As you work, ask yourself this question: in what different ways do the materials bend? Don't forget to record your findings. So this worksheet will be given to students, probably read out loud to them to help with the struggling readers. And then let's go to the next slide to see where they will record their answers. So students would select 8 objects and write and draw the object in the first column. Before they do anything with it, they would predict whether they think it will bend, and then put an X if in the next column if it did bend, under bend yes, and put an X under no if it didn't bend. So this is where we're looking for them to observe what's going on, to make a prediction about what's going on, and then to appropriately communicate what happened. Now that you're familiar with the science lesson, it's time to look at the science assignment rubric, the student answer key, and some sample work. So let's go ahead and see what that means. The assignment rubric you're going to use to grade the student's sample work is shown here. You can see the three science skills: observing, predicting, and communicating, and some hints about where you should look to score students' answers. 4 levels are given: novice, which is worth 1 point, apprentice, which is worth 2 points, practitioner 3, and expert 4. So simply look at the student's work, read the descriptions under each level, and mark what you think the student's work is worth. Now, you don't turn in the rubrics. I'll show you what you do. Here's an example of one of the students. Each of the students has a name. This is James's work. You can see he's drawn a little piece of foil and he's written foil. He's predicted that it would not bend, and he's had a little trouble because he's marked both boxes about whether it bent. So he's a little confused. So you're going to go through and look at each student's work and then use the rubric to score the work. Some of the pictures and writing are difficult to interpret, so I've given you an answer key in terms of what item they tested and what they should have seen. So the first item, as we saw with James, was the foil, and yes, he should have seen that bending. So if you're confused, look at the student answer key for what they observed and what they should, or rather the object they tested and what they should have observed. Instead of handing in individual rubrics, you're going to convert the scores to this grading table, which is on the template. So what did James get for the observing score? What did he get for the predicting score? What did he get for the communicating score? What were his total points? And then you might go back and look at the work and say, well, where did he have some misunderstandings? What do you think his problems were? And if you noted any strengths, go ahead and record those as well. Now there are 4 students, James, Juanita, Mary, and Sam. In addition, I'd like you to do an average score by adding up all their scores and dividing it by 4. So let's just take some numbers. Suppose James got a 2 on observing and Juanita got a 3. That would be 2 plus 3 is 5. If Mary got a 3, that would be 5 plus 3 is 8. And let's say Sam got a 4, that would be 12 divided by 4. Then the average score for observing would be 3 out of 4. That's what I mean on average. And what did the class do overall, not just for observing, but for predicting, for communicating? What was the class average overall? Now that you have your scores, you're going to do a couple of different analyses. First, and this is very important for the edTPA, you have to look at the class or the group as a whole and explain their weaknesses and strengths. So each of these questions is worth 1 point. Which science skill on average was the strongest? So you're going to look at those average numbers that we talked about in the previous slide and see which was the highest, which was the lowest or the weakest, and what could you do with the whole group to improve the weak science skill. So how would you reteach that skill? Now I realize many of you aren't science teachers, so what I'm looking for here is that you recognize what the skill is and come up with something simple if it's observing, for example, how could you teach the class to observe better? The second type of analysis you need to do is called individual student analysis. And so here, what I'd like you to do is to pick 2 students whose work demonstrates a similar type of difficulty. So maybe 2 had difficulty with observing. That was their low score. So explain what it was. See if there was a common misunderstanding or common confusion. And what could you do to address that and to correct their misunderstanding or to reteach that particular skill? Be sure to identify the students by name so I know who you're talking about. Now, try to pick one student who appears to have mastered the standard. So the skill or the standard. Are you talking about maybe they've mastered all of the science process skills, or maybe they've just mastered the concept of bendability, which is probably what your standard is aligned to. And then what could you do to challenge that student? So they've mastered bendability of these items. Is there something you could think of that would push them a little bit farther? The last step is about providing specific feedback. Now we know from research that providing very specific feedback is one of the most important things you can do when you're teaching students. So what do I mean by specific feedback? I mean feedback that identifies students' strengths and then something they can improve on, and then closing it off with a strength. So I like to call it the hamburger method. You start with the bun, which is something the students are doing quite well, or try to find something positive to say. But then you're going to say, but I noticed you did this here, and I'd like you to try this a different way. I'd like you to improve on this. And then follow it up with another compliment. So let's say one of the students, and I don't know this, but let's say one of the students really struggled in the lesson. Maybe the student just didn't get the concept of bendability because he doesn't know how to observe and write down. So he's really struggling with observation and communication. But maybe the pictures he drew were really just beautiful. So you could say something like, I really like the pictures that you do. I can tell that you really like to draw. Now, next time, what I'd like you to do is watch carefully and not mark your answers before you see what happens. And then go ahead and draw some of those beautiful pictures again. So do you see how I did the hamburger method? Complement specific action you want the student to take, and then complement. It could be that the student, by the way, is not just having trouble with observing. It could be that the student doesn't understand where to put the X's. So if you think that's the misunderstanding, maybe they're marking all the boxes. Maybe you need to clear up that misunderstanding. So you're going to do that with one student who was really struggling. Again, identify that student by name. And then one student that had a lot of strengths. And then you're going to provide the same type of specific feedback, excuse me, but this time, what are you going to do to challenge the student to go a little bit farther? I really like how you were carefully observing and your predictions matched your observations. Now I want you to, and whatever it is. So that's a little bit about specific feedback and this particular lesson. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me.